All right, so are you ready to like really get into it with this deep dive? You know, you sent over this paper, The Extended Mind, and whoa, this one really makes you think. You know what I mean? Like about the boundaries of thinking.
Mhm.
Like literally, where does the mind even end and the world begin? That's the question that Andy Clark and David Chalmers were grappling with back in 1998 in this paper. And you know what? It's still a hot topic even today.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a question that has, like you said, really captivated philosophers for a long time, for centuries even. But what makes this paper so interesting, I think, is that it takes this really kind of like big philosophical question
Yeah.
and it brings it down to earth. You know what I mean? Like it grounds it in real world examples, even in stuff from cognitive
It's
science.
so refreshing, isn't it? It's not just like some abstract,
Yeah.
thought experiment, which I really appreciate. Okay, so before we like get too far into their big idea, let's sort of set the stage a bit. You know, traditionally there have always been two main camps when we talk about the mind-body problem, that whole thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
On the one hand, you have people who are like, look, the mind, it's totally internal. It's all happening up here, all between our ears.
Right.
But then you have other folks who say, no, 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 wait, external things totally affect how we think. Like language is a perfect example.
Yeah.
But even those people still kind of see those influences as like indirect, right? Like historical effects.
Yeah, they're not like in the moment, you know?
Exactly.
And that's where Clark and Chalmers come in and they're like, what if we're thinking about all of this the wrong way? And they propose this third view called active externalism. And basically it argues that the environment isn't just kind of sitting there, in the background, like passively while we're thinking. It's actually super involved. It's like actively shaping our thoughts in real time as we're having them.
Whoa, okay. I'm already hooked, but I'm a very visual learner. So can you give me an example?
For sure. So they use this really great example of Tetris. You know that game, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to fit those blocks into the
Oh,
gaps.
yeah. I've wasted way too many hours.
Right. And so you have two options, right?
Yeah.
You can mentally rotate that block in your head,
Yeah.
see if it fits. Or you could use that handy rotate button. Now, most people, what do? They use the button. It's way easier.
I mean, who wouldn't, right? It's so much easier.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that studies have shown that players who use the button aren't just faster, which we would expect,
Right.
but they're actually using that button as like part of how they're solving the problem. Like they'll rotate a block multiple times. They use that visual feedback to figure out where it fits best.
Yeah.
And they do all of that before they even move the block.
So it's not just like a convenience thing. It's like that button is becoming part of their thought process. That's so wild.
Right. And that is a perfect example of what Clark and Chalmers call an epistemic action. It's an action that's designed to change the world around you in a way that helps you think better. So in this case, it's not just moving a block around. It's about offloading some of that cognitive work onto something else, in this case, the game itself.
We're like outsourcing part of our brain, which, I think we do that all the time in our daily lives, don't we?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We do it all the time. Think about it. We write stuff down to remember things.
Okay.
We use our fingers to count. Like, think about if you're cooking, you're arranging stuff on the counter. We're always manipulating our environment to make thinking easier.
Okay, so we've got Tetris, we've got our notepads, we got kitchens, but they take this idea even further in the paper, right? They start talking about neural implants and like cyborgs, which is kind of freaky.
Yeah, they do. They love a good thought experiment.
Yeah.
Imagine way in the future, okay, we have these implants and they can do complex calculations just instantly like that, like mentally rotating those Tetris blocks, like warp speed. Would we think about using that implant differently than if we were doing it ourselves, in our own heads, I mean?
That is a tough one because, if the implant was like totally seamlessly part of our brain, it would almost feel like it's just another part of us.
Exactly, and that is their point.
Yeah.
They're saying that if a tool is reliable, if it's always there when you need it and you totally trust it, it basically becomes part of your mind. And it doesn't matter if it's inside your skull or out in the world.
Okay.
And this is where they introduce the case of Otto.
Ah, yes, Otto and his notebook. Tell me about Otto.
Otto has Alzheimer's. So he uses a notebook to like remember stuff and to get around in the world. It's not just reminders, it's like his lifeline. He keeps everything in there, appointments, addresses, facts, you name it. So the paper talks about him wanting to visit the Museum of Modern Art. And so instead of, trying to remember the address, he just looks in his notebook, 53rd Street, got it, and off he goes.
Seems pretty straightforward, right? But the paper asks this really interesting question. Does Ardo believe that the museum is on 53rd Street even before he looks in the notebook? Or does that belief only happen when he sees it written down? What do you think?
Well, that's where things get really philosophically interesting. Clark and Chalmers, say that if Otto's notebook is always there, if it's always up to date, and he trusts it completely, it's basically like his memory,
Hmm.
you know? It's there to guide his actions and his thoughts, just like any belief that we have in our head.
So it's not just a tool, it's like part of his belief system.
Exactly. And they talk about some arguments against this, too. Some people might say, well, Otto can't always access his notebook. What if he takes a shower? But people with normal memories forget things all the time, too.
Yeah.
You know, it's about what that information does, how it shapes how we see the world.
Hmm. I'm starting to see where this is going. If we accept that Otto's notebook is part of his mind, does that mean we're all like walking around as extended systems? Like our phones, our calendars, our Google searches, are those part of our minds too?
That's a great question, and one that we'll talk about more next time. But I think it's safe to say that this paper, The Extended Mind, it really makes us rethink those boundaries.
Okay, I gotta say, I'm hooked. Are you telling me my phone is like part of my mind? That's a little crazy, right? But seriously, where do we even like begin to draw the line? Does everything that we interact with like become an extension of us? I mean, I love my coffee mug, but I'm pretty sure it's not like shaping my beliefs about, the meaning of life.
Right. It's a good point. It's not just about using something. It's about like a deeper connection, a cognitive partnership, like working together,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And actually, the paper gives us some guidelines to think about this. They talk about constancy, ease of access, and automatic endorsement.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those terms actually mean?
Okay, so constancy means the tool or resource is always there when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talked about, Otto's notebook is always with him. Ease of access means how easy it is to get that information. Like, can you get to it without having to do a ton of work? And automatic endorsement is about trust. Do you just accept that information without even questioning it? Like it's coming from your own brain.
So it's not just about using something, it's about how deeply it's like a part of how you think. Makes sense because, some things are way more important to how we think than others.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because where you draw that line might be different from where I draw the line. It becomes like a personal thing,
Mm-hmm.
what's part of your extended mind.
So there's not a rule. It's more about like how much you depend on something, how much you trust it, how smoothly it fits into how you think.
Yeah, it's about the role something plays in your thinking. And this opens up a bunch of other questions, right?
Yeah.
If our minds could extend outward, could they also extend to other people? Could our interactions, like our relationships, could those be a form of extended cognition too?
Whoa, now that's a mind-blowing thought. Like, okay, think about my best friend. We've been friends forever. We can finish each other's sentences. We know what the other one's thinking without even talking, or like a two-person extended mind.
It's a really interesting possibility. Think about teams working together, on some big project, or even like entire communities sharing knowledge and traditions.
Hmm.
There's so much going on there. A lot of shared thinking, reliance on other people's expertise.
You could say that these groups are like creating some sort of collective extended mind.
Okay, so maybe minds aren't just, one person. It's more like a system where everyone's connected.
Hmm.
And what about the internet? We're constantly plugged in, accessing all this information. Is the internet like the ultimate extended mind?
That's something that Clark and Chalmers actually talk about in the paper. And it all goes back to those criteria we were talking about. Do you think the internet is reliable, easy to access, and do you trust it? For some people, the answer is probably yes. They're online all the time. They're using that information in their thinking all the time.
Oh, I know people like that they live online. It's like an
Well,
extension of their brain, their social life, their everything.
right. But for others, it might just be a tool, something they use sometimes.
Mm.
It's not as integrated into how they think. I guess it just depends on how you use it, how much you need it, and how much you trust it. So we're back to that personal thing again. It's not the same for everyone, right? There's no one definition of what is an extended mind.
Exactly. Active externalism isn't about, drawing lines in the sand.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that our minds are constantly changing, always interacting with the world. It's a way to understand how we think,
Yeah.
not like a set of rules.
Okay, let's just take a minute to recap because we've talked about a lot. Active externalism basically changes how we think about thinking. It says the mind isn't just stuck in our brains. It can go out into the world. It can use tools, resources, even other people to process information and understand the world.
And it challenges us to rethink what we mean by belief or memory, or even what the self is. If our minds are extended, does that mean that we are bigger than we think? That we're not just individuals, but part of this larger network?
Yeah. It's like those boundaries of the self get all blurry. We're connected to the world, to the things we use to each other. It's kind of beautiful in a way, right?
It is. And it makes us ask all sorts of questions about who we are, how we think, what it even means to be human in a world where everything is so connected.
I gotta be honest. This whole extended mind thing is kind of making me see things differently. Like, even sitting here right now, my mind feels like it's reaching out, you know? Like it's
Right.
connecting to my phone, my computer, those books over there, even to you just by talking.
That's what I love about it. It makes us see ourselves and the world as this like web,
Mhm.
like we're all connected. It's like a whole new way of seeing things, realizing how we're always interacting with and being shaped by
Yeah.
like everything around us.
And it makes me wonder, like, where does all of this lead? I mean, if our minds are always changing, always expanding outward, what does that mean for the future of, like, thinking itself? Are we, like, on the edge of some crazy cognitive revolution?
That's a big question for sure. The paper doesn't like predict the future or anything, but it gives us a lot to think about. Like imagine a world where the line between our minds and the world is so blurry that we can't even tell the difference anymore. Like a world where we're totally connected to information and technology and each other in ways we can't even imagine right now.
It sounds like science fiction, but it also feels like it could really happen. Like, we're already so connected to our phones and the internet. What if that just keeps going to the point where we don't even know where we end and the technology begins?
And if that happens, what does it mean for how we see ourselves, our relationships, what we're responsible for? It brings up all these like ethical questions that we as a society need to start thinking about now.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to consider, but honestly, I'm excited about it. It feels like we're on the verge of something huge, something that could change how we think, how we live, how we connect with the world.
It's a challenge for sure, but it's also like a huge opportunity. An
Mhm.
opportunity in, rethink what we thought were our limits, to see what's really possible. And to me, that's like the most important part of this whole extended mind idea. It's not just some theory. It's like an invitation to explore, you know,
Yeah.
to embrace how connected we all are, to see the world and ourselves in a whole new way.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about, and I bet our listeners are feeling the same way. If you're curious and you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out the full paper, The Extended Mind. It's a deep dive, but trust me, it's worth it. And hey, maybe we'll do another deep dive sometime, exploring some of the stuff we've talked about today. But until then, keep those minds open, keep asking those big questions, and keep exploring those lines between our minds and the world.